everybody. Welcome to your video series on an introduction to sociology. The topic for this video is technology and media. So let's get started. We're going to start this discussion with a concept called the digital divide. And what do we mean by the digital divide? We're going to define the digital divide as the uneven access to technology among different races, classes, and geographic areas. So what does that mean exactly? Well, we know that not everybody in our society has the same access to technology as everybody else. We also know that not everybody has the best or latest technology, and that's going to depend, among other things, on your race or ethnic identity, your economic class, and where you live. So, for example, people who are living in Chaparral or our rural areas here in New Mexico may not have the same access to technology as folks who are living in our urban areas like Santa Fe, Albuquerque, or even here in Las Cruces. And even if people do have technology, that technology may not be the best technology or the latest technology that is allowing them to keep up with all that we know we need when it comes to using technology. Unfortunately, the digital divide can also lead to what we call the knowledge gap. And what do we mean by the knowledge gap? Well, the knowledge gap is an ongoing and increasing gap in information for those who do have less access to technology. We know that life here in the 21st century really is dependent on a person being able to access the latest and most important information and knowledge that we have in order to lead a successful life. And if people don't have good access to technology, that often means they're being left behind when it comes to the information and knowledge that technology brings. For example, we've already talked about the discrepancy between a place like Doña Ana Community College and a Harvard University. So certainly Doña Ana Community College here in southern New Mexico has come a long way in terms of providing access to technology in our classrooms, on our campuses, making sure our students have good access to technology through the use of iPads, for example. We've been giving out free iPads to eligible students for several years since the COVID-19 pandemic. But we will have to recognize and acknowledge that our technology on our campuses may not be the same as the technology that is available to students at places like Harvard or Yale or Stanford. Further, we know that there are larger percentages of Black and brown people who use smartphones for their internet access than do their white counterparts. And while smartphones are terrific little devices, they don't often have the encompassing capabilities that a laptop or a desktop computer would have. 80% of white people in our culture own computers, whereas only about 60% of our Black and brown people own computers. And while that may not seem like a big difference, we're talking about, about 20% of our Black and brown population that are lagging behind their white counterparts in terms of having access to good technology. 78% of our households do have internet access. That is growing, of course. But where people suffer from good internet access are our rural areas and our low-income areas, which, of course, New Mexico has a lot of rural areas and low-income areas. Those folks likely only are represented about 60 to 65% with good access to technology. If you are someone who has access to technology and you have good internet access, just imagine your life without that connection and without those devices. When the power goes down, right, we're all equal. None of us have access, and we know how frustrating and powerless that can feel. Let's talk a little bit about the media. We're going to look at a few terms here and concepts. The first one is media homogenization and media fragmentation. So what do we mean by these terms, and how do they relate to sociology? Homogenization in the media is really about looking at what kinds of information, news, and stories are coming out of our media. Back in 1995, research done by McManus showed that different news outlets were all telling the same stories, using the same sources, which were resulting in the same messaging presented with only slight variations. So back in the 90s, we were basically all getting the same information. There are some pluses and minuses to that, as long as that information is factual and objective. Fast forward 10 years to 2005, and what we found is with the growth of the internet and alternative news sources, that people were increasingly customizing their news experience to basically support their already given worldview, their values, and their beliefs. So people in the 2000s really aren't necessarily looking at news to help inform their worldview or inform their knowledge base. They're looking at news sources to confirm their existing worldview and their existing beliefs and values about a particular topic. And that's not really the role of the media, is it? The role of the media should be to provide us with objective, real-world, informative, factual, evidence-based information, whether it supports our worldview or not. The last term here we're going to look at is oligopoly, which is where a few very wealthy, powerful people are able to control a particular industry, whatever that may be. And what we're finding now in the mid 2000s is that the corporations that are running our media outlets are becoming smaller and smaller. They are swallowing each other up. In other words, for example, in 1983, we had 50 corporations owning the bulk of our news outlets. Today, that was in 1999, 90% of that news media was controlled by only 5 companies. And even in 2014, the 5 biggest companies were Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, CBS, and Viacom. So you can see how problematic that becomes when we have basically 5 people. If you think about the CEOs of these corporations, 5 people providing 350 plus million people, the population of the United States, with our information and our news. That doesn't leave a lot of room for competing voices or voices that might challenge whatever narrative those companies might be wanting to get through. Now, let's think about our sociological perspectives. We're going to look at 3 of them in terms of how they would interpret our use of technology and the role of the media in our culture. If we look at functionalism, if you remember back from chapter 1, developed by Emil Durkheim, functionalism is seeing society as a structure made up of all of these interconnecting parts. So the media is basically a part of that society. And from a functionalist perspective, we just want to think about, well, what is the function of media? What is its manifest function? What is its latent function? And are there any dysfunctions to the media? Obviously, the manifest function, the intended purpose of media, is to give us information, right? Also, the role of the media can be to entertain, but those are very 2 different kinds of media. And then we can get into the latent functions and the dysfunctions of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and all the things that we know are going on today with the use of the internet. When we switch over to the conflict perspective, remember the conflict perspective is looking at groups of people competing for power and resources. So the questions we're interested with a conflict perspective are who controls our media and tech firms, and what agenda, if any, do these folks have, and what are the effects of the digital divide? Who is suffering as a result of not having good access to technology, and what is the result of that knowledge gap when we have huge numbers of people who do not have the same level of knowledge and information that others have? What does that mean for us as a society? And then lastly, if we think about symbolic interactionism, looking at society at the micro level, our individual interactions on a daily basis through the use of symbols and learning and labeling. The question here is, well, what does technology symbolize in our society? What has it come to mean to us as individuals? And we can look at sort of the discrepancy between people who love technology, the technophiles, versus the people who really do not embrace technology, the neo-Luddites, and what kinds of experiences are those people having based on how they see technology in our society. Now, let's look at real quickly here about how sociology can come alive in the real world, particularly with this chapter on the media and technology. Lots of discussion about video games and how video games do or do not impact a person's behavior. These studies have been going on for a long, long time, since the advent of video games, since the rise in our school shootings, for example. And so a lot of people have been studying this issue. Psychologists Anderson and Bushman reviewed over 40 years of research on this subject. In 2003, they determined that there is a causal linkage between violent video games and aggression. However, there are also studies that indicate that there is scant evidence that violent video games cause physical violence or criminal behaviors. So what does this mean? This means that the ability to directly link a person's playing these violent video games and then acting out aggressively is really hard to establish. There does seem to be some connection here between people who are immersed in this video game culture and the likelihood that they might engage in physical behavior themselves. However, there are a lot of other factors that go into determining whether somebody is going to act out aggressively based on their playing these video games, because we know that there are tons and tons of people who play these games and do not act out in any way, have no criminal history, but some do. So we have to dive a little bit deeper into that to figure out what are those other factors that are leading to someone, in addition to violent video games, to acting out. So that's going to do it for now. Thanks for checking in. Never stop learning.